here.
Oh, that's amazing.
What is it? We have everyone on here that needs to be on here.
The main players are. I don't see some of the CSI guys. Are they booked up today? Well, I see Andrew and is here, but no Sheldon.
Yeah, Ryan can. He'll be on next week.
Yeah.
And Chappie said he's going to try and pop on for a quick half hour.
Okie dokie.
Yeah, we even had some Dave Bem's folks said they want to get in on this. I wonder if any of those guys are out there. Shout out to the Newfoundland crowd.
I'm part Newfie.
You're part, which part are you?
That quarter, lower leg.
Montreal, man. You're from Montreal, right?
Yeah, but my relatives all moved in from out east.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, my grandpa's a Newfie.
All right, Jordan.
Okay. Well, I don't have the name of the panelists, so you're gonna have to do that part. Can I share my screen, Sam?
Yeah, you got co-host. Trev, start reading your chats anytime here, my friend. Your duties.
We're not acting like this is too formal anyways. So I've been tasked with introducing this. Trev can introduce our panelists after. If he sends them to me, I can do it and they can themselves. But loosely, we want to have a little bit of a chat about long-term athlete development and going by the kind of ISFAM by model that Sport Canada and a lot of the sports in Canada and actually across the world now have adopted, just so that we're on the same page about it. This progression along with chronological and developmental age through the different stages. I think it's weird going on here with my computer. This is one from Athletics Canada from a while ago, progressing through from active start, fundamentals, learning to train to train, learn to compete, train to compete, learning to win, winning for a living, into pro sport. And then one of the pieces that I hope we get a lot of conversation about today are just these chronological and developmental ages, and then these windows of trainability, or the theory of, and I chose those words intentionally because this is what I'm interested for people to maybe debate about, because I'm not aware of any actual physiological evidence that there are periods of accelerated development related to developmental age that aren't linked to simple growth and maturation. And then just another graphic of the model, essentially where people are developing physical literacy earlier on in their life, earlier on in their careers, deciding to specialize and train for a sport for performance. And at any point in time, whether they select to or the sport selects them out, they jump into the active for life or the recreation stream. So we do have some people on here. I think Trev has a piece that he wants to speak about as far as youth and adolescent weightlifting development and probably a few other things. We have Rafi and Brandon from Brock, if those guys want to introduce themselves here in a second. And I'm not sure if we have anybody on here from Dave's lab. If I'm guessing, I saw a new face, last name Duffett. Might be a Newfoundlander, but I might be wrong. So Brandon, yep, he's on here somewhere. Brandon, could we have you just introduce yourself real quickly, followed by Rafi, and then Dale LeBlanc as well, who is out of Joe Baker's lab at York, focused on more so talent ID, I guess, than development. But so we'll go Brandon, Rafi, and then Dale.
Sure. Thanks, Jordan. So my name's Brandon. I'm a PhD student at Brock University. And my research is really focused on youth physical activity development, pretty much high performance athletes. So in my master's, all my research focused around different types of training modalities, such as plyometric training, resistance training, and sort of mechanisms that were underpinning those changes. So we looked at muscle hypertrophy, neuromuscular adaptation, and things like that. And now my research is focused predominantly on recovery inflammation, immune function in high performance athletes, looking at the supplementation side of things. So really well-rounded sort of research project, but all focusing on pediatric high performance athletes there.
Awesome. Thanks, buddy. Rafi, you're still on mute there in the bottom left hand of your screen. You should be a microphone with a red line through it. If you click on that, you should be able to talk.
Well,
There you go.
no, I should. I'm not.
We can hear you now.
You can hear me. Okay.
Yep.
Excellent. So I'm Rafi Dotan. I'm lab coordinator in exercise physiology at Brock. Well, in my career as an exercise physiologist, I dealt with endurance physiology, and now and for many years I've been doing pediatric exercise physiology. In particular, we are studying child-adult differences in muscle activation, which apparently has bearings on almost any pediatric performance when you compare it to adults. So hopefully I'll be able to contribute to the discussion here as long as it will get into pediatric performance. Yeah. Okay, looking forward to what is going to turn up here.
Dale next.
Yeah, hey everybody, Dale Bonds. I work with Jordan in Petawawa right now. I'm doing some research in Dr. Joe Baker's lab out of York University. So I start my PhD in September. I did my master's with him. We're just submitting it right now. Anyway, but I'm more specifically interested in talent ID, specifically in the military population. So the PhD will be in our selection pathway and actually examining some of the predictive values within that. Otherwise, strength and conditioning coach by trade, spent 4 years with Athletics Canada. Great to see Ian on there again. Some awesome faces and stuff. So yeah, I'm really excited you guys put this together and look forward to the conversation.
Okay, so first question or point of discussion, and I think that this will flow pretty well for the panelists first, and then we'll let anybody else jump in there as far as conversation. Certainly would like to have some input from Steve if he's actively participating, Steve Lidstone, and Trev as well, and those of you strength and conditioning coaches that are working down through those developmental levels. So for the panelists, briefly, just sorry, I was looking at the chat. Briefly, what's your understanding of the implementation of kind of the Sport Canada LTAD model, and how do you use that to influence your practice? So how do you use the LTAD model to influence practice in the development of athletes? We can start off with Brandon. Brandon, I know you come from more of a research background, but you know, how would you use this to inform stakeholders or other coaches on how to use the LTAD or developmental model for youth athletes?
So currently right now, I was participating as a technical coach at a youth soccer club here in Milton. So the issue with that is that there's a big resistance right now to applying sort of resistance or strength training modalities, any modalities to this population. The reason for this is just erroneous sort of values that surround resistance training, and that it'll stunt your growth or hurt growth plates and things like that. So the way that I approached it was really from an education model, and I used the long-term athlete development to sort of guide this process. And show them that, you know, resistance training isn't all about loading up the child with weights. It can look a lot different, and showing them how learn to train and train to train, train to compete, and all of those different types of progressions through till train to compete may look like. And by using that, it sort of educated this population and sold them on the fact that children do or can resistance train and can both grow and develop even to similar extents that we observe in adults with respect to strength increases, power increases, vertical jump, things like that. So it was really a hard sell for them at the beginning, but once that I showed them that strength training can be applied to this population in a safe manner, and it wasn't going to hurt their growth or stunt their growth or any of those negative connotations surrounding what has been previously put out there in the literature and the lay media, they all jumped on board. So that's sort of my piece there with respect to what I've experienced, at least at a youth sport level.
Thanks. Rafi, with respect to some of the research that you've done and you guys are doing in your lab at Brock or previously, how have you helped inform sporting groups with respect to youth development models? Things that conflict with or actually reinforce kind of traditional coaching?
Rafi, did you hear the question?
Well, I didn't realize it was directed to me. I'm not
Sorry.
I'm not a coach. I coach my son in cycling, but
Well, the
Okay,
question
well,
was, yeah,
say
ask it
go
again,
ahead.
George.
again, what do you want to hear from me?
Sorry, I was asking about, how have you used information out of your lab to inform stakeholders, coaches, sporting organizations with respect to long-term athletic development, whether that information is kind of backing up their traditional approach or in conflict with
Well, the
coaching
plain
approach.
truth is that we don't typically deal with athletes. Could be every once in a long while an athlete would come and ask to be tested in something, but we don't normally do that. But with our experience with pediatric exercise physiology and some of the things that Brandon has mentioned as far as weight training or strength training that has been suffering a lot from prejudices. We have shown throughout the years with meta-analysis that Professor Brackett Falk has done years ago and so forth in all kind of ways that children benefit from strength training as much as adults. And at least under supervision, they are not prone to injuries more than adults. But to tell you that I'm working with coaches or athletes on any direct way, I cannot say that.
Thanks, Rafi. Let's get it from Dale. And Dale, I want you to tie this in a little bit to your experience at AC as far as working across working across the different age groups, and then actually how it tied into kind of youth results and that little project that you did.
Yeah, so it's funny, and the old adage for me is, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And to me, the LTAD is probably the prime candidate for this. And I really think to even start a conversation about it, we have to step back and understand what the intent versus the implementation of it is. And I think a lot of the time, the challenge is that through good intention, sports create a LTAD model out of good intention, but then it has unintended consequences. And so I can speak specifically to my experience with Athletics Canada Track and Field. They've really developed some good documentation. The problem is in the actual implementation of it, we've seen that it's really not a linear process at all. The second things start being deterministic, it really it scares me a little bit and it starts falling apart. I did a little project through my lab with Joe, and what we did is we examined world junior championship performances in relationship to medal performances. This has been done across multiple sports, and really it was actually a negative predictor for success in medal performances later in their career. So I went back to, I think it was 20 years back, and I think there was only 2 people who placed in the top 8 in their world junior performances that then had any kind of world success, world championships, Olympic games, top 8 finishes later. So if we start saying that this is any kind of predictive model, I really think we have to wave some flags and ask some questions. And for me, again, it's that the second it starts becoming that deterministic approach, it starts to scare me a little bit.
Awesome, thanks. Before I get on to Trev and kind of youth weightlifting, also my screen's like kind of freezing up, but I think you guys can still hear me. I'd like to hear from a few guys like Andrew Cochran or Grant Turner. I can't see much more of the screen, or Dave McDowell, as far as people that have experience in a strength and conditioning setting with youth athletes and the interplay between trying to give them what they need within the LTAD and blend that in with what they're doing in their sport. And you know, how you've used this in your coaching practice.
Yeah, I can go first. I mean, I think in terms of it, kind of, as you kind of use the right word in terms of blending, I think it's in terms of that really starting off with building up those basics in terms of like the younger they are, the more basics. I think you also kind of hit it in terms of your first initial comments, where it's like there's not a whole lot of empirical evidence to actually support some of these models, even though they are widely adopted in a lot of different countries and things like that. So yeah, I think it's kind of like one of those things where certainly we'll look at things like peak height velocity, understanding like coordination, and maybe there might be some laxity in some of the tendons, et cetera, and things like that when they're hitting that peak height velocity. So trying to incorporate that into some of the practices and things like that, but also just making sure that we're creating as much of a solid foundation for them, be it strength or whatever in the beginning. And it really, beyond that, like it kind of making sure the foundation is there, and then it really progresses on a more individual basis from there, because obviously there's a big spectrum or a big difference between biological age and chronological age. So trying to pigeonhole certain athletes into a particular quote unquote window based off of whether they're 14 or 15 is a difficult thing to do. So it's certainly, as much as we try to make it a science, there's certainly a lot of art to it as well.
I love it. Thanks, buddy. Before we go to Grant, I didn't even queue up Cochran with this. This is where I see the model. I see the model as looking at athletes as individuals with potentially some generalities that can give us starting points. Because the windows, the progression, all of that stuff, it doesn't really, it's not a linear process like you were saying. So it really just has us focus on the individuality of it all. Grant, can you jump in here potentially and talk about some ways that you've been using this in a high school setting? And if you have anything formalized with it, or again, how you're blending that approach across different sports?
Sure. Well, I've actually written an LTAD document for a PSO before. So my experience is, I guess, on both sides of the coin. So having to write it and come up with something that was useful for other coaches, and then how I use it in my own practice, they don't really match up that well. The stuff that I had to do for Muay Thai Canada was essentially just, to get our PSO status and tick all the boxes that we were supposed to do. But the only real tool that I use from the LTAD model is maybe introducing peak height velocity to help with buy-in, right? It's like a cool trick to show the kids that how, when they're going to have their growth spurts and stuff like that. And then if there is issues with I guess backslide in results and whether a kid's feeling frustrated, then we can use that data as well to let them know that they're going through a transitional time and stuff like that. But that's really where it's useful in an application perspective. From a reference guide perspective, that's when you start getting into the more scientific models that have been introduced after the Bali influence, I think.
Awesome. Thanks. So now Trev is going to screen share with us a presentation on strength training, youth weightlifting. Trev, Are you ready to go on that? Because I'm going to jump
Yep,
off
I'm
here
ready.
actually and reset my system. Okay.
I'm ready. Let's see if this comes up.
All right. Over to you, man.
Oops. Okay, so for those of you who know me, most of you do, I've been in this business a long time. And one of the reasons I went on and got my PhD and I teach in a kinesiology program is because all my life I've been involved in strength culture, and all my life I've been fighting against mythology that exists amongst strength. You have to understand, when I started to get involved, weight training had no strength benefit, or weight training had no health benefits. Weight training slowed you down. Weight training made you inflexible. Weight training caused growth plate injuries in children. Squats were bad for the knees. Weight training caused injury. Time is fast now, 40 years later, and you know that pretty much all that's not true. So the research is gradually catching up. The problem is that research in resistance training is quite difficult, and there's nowhere that it's more difficult than research into youth lifting. So if you've never seen lifters like this before, it's important that you sit there and watch this video for a second and look at this 13-year-old moving weights, you know, in the 300, 350 pound range like it's air. On this talk, we have a lot of accomplished strength coaches, grown men, who could never even dream of what this 13-year-old is lifting right now. And this 13-year-old obviously is an extreme example of an American lifter, but he is steroid free, he is an all-natural athlete, and he's not the only one in the world lifting like that, and he's not the only one in America lifting like this. This is relatively common in Canada and in the USA. Despite this, we're still filled with misconceptions about what kids can and cannot do when it comes to training. And we come up with things like an LTAD model. And the LTAD is cute, and I get it, it's holistic. It's trying to make coaches aware that there should be some planning in place when developing a young athlete, but it's based on almost nothing, right? As we've all agreed, it doesn't really work. I've sat through numerous LTAD talks with my own kids' coaches, and they say, oh yeah, we follow this plan and sport for life and everything else. And then they go out on the hockey rink and it just becomes the same old stuff. Qualify for a rep team, play hockey year round, don't do strength training unless there's some personal trainer involved in the team who will take them out in the locker room and do some push-ups and jumping jacks, right? So it's really not, it's talked about, it's cute, it's pretty, it makes for nice glossy brochures. It's great to go around the country and give talks on LTAD. People think that you're smart, but the reality is the model hasn't been tested and proven. There's a lot of examples of countries that specialize and do quite well without these kinds of LTAD models. And I think overall research has still not caught up to what the potential of youth really is. We are clueless as to what kids can do and when it comes to physical capacity. And especially in Canada, we're even farther behind than in the US. In the US, of course, I spent time in Arizona, California, and in Texas, of course. And they start their kids in organized lifting programs. They don't even know what physical literacy is. Nobody knows what that means down there. They just know that you start the kids lifting earlier, they're better athletes later on. So Canadians are far behind, research is far behind. And you know what? If you do research with kids, God bless you, because it's very difficult. There's more than 10 reasons why researching with kids sucks. It's very difficult to do. And because of that, we don't have much research out there. So even though we've caught up that resistance training is fine for health and resistance training can help prevent injury and all these things we've learned about resistance training, it's still a long way off when it comes to kids. Kids are the last ones to be tested. Everybody's afraid of working with kids. In order for me to get ethics approval, I have to jump more hoops to work with kids. You can't get into schools to get kids in your studies. You have to jump so many hurdles to get anybody to sign up for your study. You get kids in your study and you're only able to work with them once or twice a week. You have a really long learning curve for any kind of technique. You're working with kids and you're trying to get an athletic population. Well, their sports coaches will take over and the kid will miss half of his training sessions with you. So what conclusions can you make from it? Because of the ethics issues and because of all the mythology around kids, We take these super conservative approaches with the training of children and youth and adolescents, just similar to what we did in chronic disease environments. For years, we wouldn't even do strength training in women following breast cancer surgery because we thought it would hurt them. And we wouldn't do resistance training in people following cardiovascular disease because we thought it would hurt them. Well, we're still not doing resistance training very effectively in youth because people have these misconceptions that it might hurt them. And then if you work with kids, kids are just difficult to work with. Like you get kids in there and they're like loosey goofy, they couldn't care less about what's going on. And so they don't put in full effort. So you're not sure what to do with that data sometimes. And then gosh almighty, it's really hard to take muscle biopsies from kids. Why won't they let us do that? I don't know. If we could do that, it would sure make things easier. And then we try and do body composition because we can't take muscle biopsies. We're doing these indirect measures of lean mass changes. And the body comp algorithms don't work. They haven't been established for kids. So we're not even sure if the total lean mass is changing some kinds. So we're doing it indirectly through ultrasound and those kinds of measuring techniques. And then, of course, anytime you see an improvement in a young kid, the first thing that anybody will say, is, whether it's a reviewer or a PhD supervisor or whatever it may be, was, well, how do you know it wasn't just maturational changes? So any gain that you make in the weight room, well, that's just maturational changes, of course. And well, kids won't adapt like that. No, that's just normal growth. And so you just run into these walls over and over again. And then you run into the problem just in any research. Once something's in print and you observe something different, then it's hard to get it through review boards or committees or whatever it may be, because they say, oh, no, that's not true. Someone else published something different in the past. Therefore, what you're seeing can't be true. Well, you know what? We've done so little research in kids. I think everything that comes out could be a novel finding because kids vary just like adults a ton. And then it's all made worse by the fact that most researchers doing research in this area just don't understand strength conditioning. That video I just showed of the Olympic weightlifting, I'd say the majority of people who do strength conditioning, strength training type strength adaptation research have never watched a weightlifting meet at a youth junior nationals. They've never even seen it. They don't understand what these kids are capable of doing. They've only worked in maybe in a high school or a public school physical education type setting, and they don't understand the principles that we often apply. And as a result of that, we end up with a lot of deductive assumptions. So we put things in print and we say, okay, this is what we think is going on. We make our best guesses and we say, all right, kids are weaker than adults. Why? Well, you know, they just aren't able to grow. They don't have testosterone. So they just aren't going to have the same muscle mass. And so kids are never going to be as strong. And, you know, they can't activate the higher threshold muscle motor units and muscle fibers. Their brains aren't designed to do that yet. So their type 2 motor neurons are off. They're just not being recruited. You get comments like, you should only do low load, high volume. That's the only way to train youth safely. And because of that, us in the strength conditioning profession are kind of pigeonholed into very simplistic programs when we actually train our youth. And then we're dealing with all this windows of trainability, that there's, you know, strength is maxed at this point. To train it earlier is a waste of time. To train it later is a waste of time, which is just utter garbage. You know, the evidence for this is based off 1 or 2 studies performed in 1988 in, you know, Latvia or something like that. It's just, there's not enough information for us to determine things. And then on top of it all, this peak height velocity, like, yes, there's a huge benefit to going through puberty when it comes to strength adaptation, but it's not that simple. There's a heck of a lot more to it. So I'm just going to briefly go through some of the myths, and this will hopefully fire things up and we'll get a little bit of discussion. So kids are weaker than adults. You put them in a study setting and they aren't going to contract as hard as an adult. They're not going to create as much force. Okay, we know that. I've been at CSEP meetings, Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology, and I've had people come up and say, well, kids aren't going to be able to do these programs because they aren't able to recruit type 2 motor units. They aren't able to recruit their higher threshold fibers. And, you know, there's no doubt kids have problems with this, but it's based off, and I know Rafi, you've done some of this work, it's based off some really, really equivocal studies, like not a lot of studies, and then there's variance in the outcomes. So, you know, there's studies that look at normalized isometric force production that vary a lot. There's rate of contraction, rate of relaxation studies that vary a lot. There's looking at difference in fiber types in those few studies that they've been able to look at that, and it varies a lot. We're looking at co-contractions, and it varies a lot. The nuts and bolts of it is, though, no doubt these kids have problems with that actual recruitment that motor planning, that motor programming of high threshold tasks, so high force output tasks. Well, you have to understand the way these studies are done, you know, like you take a dozen kids, if you're lucky, you bring them into the lab, you strap them to a chair, you lock their leg down, you tie their foot to a metal plate, and you tell them to plant or flex as hard as they can. And they say, oh, look, they're not as strong as the adults. Like, oh my goodness, a kid doesn't know what a calf is from a quad, and you're asking them to contract that muscle. They don't know this stuff. They haven't developed these motor programs. It's like asking a kid who's 11 years old to solve quadratic equations. They haven't learned how to do that stuff yet. And so if you approach them and say, solve a quadratic equation, and they can't do it, and you say, well, they just don't have an area of the brain required for solving math. No, that's not it at all. They just haven't learned how to do that task. And I bring that up because I've seen this. I've worked with kids for years and years and years, and I've seen this kind of assumption all the time. One of the classic study tools we use are biodex, a biodex leg extension, leg flexion, and we use this for return to play criteria. I was working with a defensive end, an elite high school athlete. He was a younger man, but he's gone halfway through puberty, let's say. He had a single leg horizontal jump, so single leg hop of 90 inches, which if you don't know much about anything, that is huge. This kid could move. He was powerful, explosive. He went to see his orthopedic surgeon. They want to see biodex data. They put him on the biodex, and they found a strength deficit in his involved leg, even though he could horizontal hop 90 inches. And they said, oh, well, this kid isn't ready, this kid. And we're looking at him going, this kid's ready. So what did we do? We came back, we taught the kid that day how to do a leg extension, leg curl on a biodex machine, because he's never done a leg extension, leg curl, and he's never used an isokinetic dynamometer. And the next day, his numbers went up 35%. Like, that's learning, and that's what's not going on in some of these research studies. Like, I've seen kids come in and do really crappy on a complex high threshold task, and then watch their buddy do it and get all upset, and then they came back and did it because they saw their buddy do it. They were motivated to do it. So we make all these huge assumptions, and I know in research we try and control the environment, and we try and do what we can with what numbers we have. But you know, one of the big assumptions is, well, because kids don't recruit as much during voluntary contraction, they just aren't activating these type 2 units because those are their higher threshold. You recruit the lower, smaller ones first. It's Henneman's size principle. But that's just an assumption. Maybe they don't. If you saw that video of the weightlifter at the start of this kid knows how to recruit type 2 muscle fibers, and he'd been doing it for a long, long time. And then the other assumption that kids can't grow. Kids can't hypertrophy. They don't have testosterone. Like, if you've ever worked with kids in the weight room, you see hypertrophy if you're training them properly. It's there. There's no doubt it's there. There's a lot of hypertrophy if you're training them properly. It's just most kids don't train properly, and they don't train hard. So this is a group of gymnasts. So gymnasts, you know, are strength endurance, some max power, some high strength, but it's body weight exercise. And you could see that there's obvious hypertrophy on these 10 to 12-year-olds compared to the average 10 to 12-year-old, no doubt. And people say, well, kids can't hypertrophy. There's no way. They don't have androgens. Hell yeah, they can hypertrophy. I've seen it in hundreds of kids. All these kids I work with. I always like showing this picture. This is my kid. So here he's at 10. This is when he started lifting. I don't have a good full body picture, but you see typical bony little 10-year-old, right? By the time he's 13, 14, he's looking fairly well developed. You can't see his quads here. If you could see his quads, they're quite developed. And then here's him 1 year later. Here's a 15-year-old, folks, who's trained fairly decently, fairly rigorously, fairly heavily, but nothing special. I didn't follow any LTAD with this person. I did the same thing I would do with an adult. I taught him basic motor patterns, and then I gradually loaded him, and then I introduced more and more power as he could tolerate it. And look at what you get. This is what happens. Yet again, you go to the research, well, what's the research doing? They're doing 8-week studies, 12-week studies with a group of kids that half of them don't show up, and most of them couldn't care less, right? So to say that, you know, kids aren't able to adapt because of things like testosterone, there's no doubt testosterone is not the only factor. And you look at Stu Phillips, he'll argue that, and he's done a few studies that show that testosterone is not the only thing, but sure, it helps. You can see there was a year of puberty between 14 and 15, and you can see there was significant development from it. And then people say, well, kids just can't get strong like adults. It's just not possible. Well, my goodness, go watch a national powerlifting or weightlifting meet. Here's the powerlifting results from the 2019 Youth Nationals, where I looked at the under 9, under 11, and under 13 age groups. You can see here's males, here's females. And what I did is normalize their best squat lift to their body weight. And you can see there's no kids that lifted in the under 9 group here. That's fine that year. But here we say they're squatting 1.3 times body weight, but it ranged quite a bit. This is a mean. 1.3 is the mean of all the lifters in all the categories, but the range was up to 1.8. Well, a 1.8 body weight squat is a pretty decent squat. That's national standard for the, I know, Canadian wrestling. It's pretty close to national rowing team, national rugby team. This is legitimate weight, 1.8. And if you look at the all-time record squat, they're squatting 2.3 times body weight, which I bet you 95% of the people on this call have never even been able to do. Yet this is what we do for a living. Over here, females, same kind of thing. They're lifting up 1.9, 2.1 of body weight. That's phenomenal. And yet we say these 11, 12, 13, no, we have to train them high rep, low weight. We have to follow this LTAD model. Like, we're clueless as to what these kids can do. And if you go to weightlifting, here's clean and jerk numbers. This is just based off records because they didn't compete this year. And here's a clean and jerk. Mean clean and jerk of all the weight classes in the under 13 category is 1.7 times body weight with a range of 1.5 to 2 times body weight. Again, who on this call has done a 2-time body weight clean and jerk? Not a hell of a lot of you. I'm looking down the line. Andrew, I don't know, pretty close? No, oh shoot. And over here, females, 1.9 times body weight under 15. Now you could say most of them are probably past the peak height velocity by now, but under 13, 1.6 times body weight, still phenomenal lifts. And so we sit there and we wring our hands and we talk about LTAD models and windows of trainability based off of research that was done kind of, sort of, I'm not gonna say half-assed, but they did what they could with what they had, and they've made the decisions that they could based off the evidence they had, but they don't understand what the true potential of youth are. It's so much more like adults. We always say, don't treat kids like mini adults. And I agree, and they are not mini adults. But when it comes to strength and movement adaptation, it is the same model, folks. If you compare youth training to adult training, what do you do when you start with a youth? You start with basic motor learning technique. What do you do when you start with an adult who's never trained before? Basic motor learning technique. What do you do with the youth when you start with them? Body weight focus. What do you do with an adult? Body weight focus. What do you do when you start with youth? High reps start to get the reps in so that they learn the movement under low duress. Same with an adult. You start with low load. Same with an adult. With youth training, low flex, oh, this should be, say, high flexibility. The adults actually tend to do more flexibility than youth. And then you progress load with technique, just like everybody else. You work with a 40-year-old, you work with a 13-year-old. It's the same model. This isn't different. Here's where the difference lies, though. Kids like power. If you've trained kids, as soon as you get them moving decently at all, you put explosion in, and they adapt to explosion. They like jumping. They like moving fast. They'd rather do a snatch than a squat once you teach them how to do it. They think it's fun. It's a game to them. They love jumping over things. They love throwing things. Whereas you don't do that with adults very much because they break. They can't tolerate those loads. Is someone hopping in? Any questions? And then with youth, what's different is you have a high tolerance for imperfection. Kids aren't going to do things perfectly for a year or two sometimes. It took my son 2 years to squat nicely, 2 years to squat decently. It'll take me with an adult, a decent adult, maybe 6 months to get a really nice squat. But you know what? I've had kids do really good squats in the first workout. And I've had adults do really good squats in the first workout. And I've had adults that have taken 5 years and still don't squat well. So there is a huge amount of variability in youth versus adults that you're going to experience. But in general, you have to have tolerance to imperfection. If you sit there and nickel and dime a kid on his technique every day, you're not going to allow them to explore. You want to give them a chance to explore and learn their body. So here's my rant, and I'm going to shut up after this for a bit, and then you guys can rip on me. Youth can gain muscle, add load. How do they gain load? Motor skill. How do they get motor skill? Practice time. And they will gain muscle. Muscle responds to load. I always tell my young kids, they say, well, when am I going to be big like this kid? Well, this kid is squatting 350 pounds. You're squatting 100 pounds. There's not enough stimulus there to really get a lot of hypertrophy. You get up to 230 pounds and you start pounding that out for 5 reps. At that point, you look down at your legs and say, whoa, my legs are getting big, right? The body responds to load. Yes, androgens help, sure, but it's not just androgens. And so you've heard me, youth aren't that much different than adults. They adapt in the weight room the same kinds of ways. What we should be focused on, though, is rate of adaptation, because you get that kid that adapts fast, that to me is the talent marker. We're going to talk with Dale about what are markers of talent. We take these snapshots of height, weight, speed, agility, train them for a month and see how they change. That is your talent marker. And then when it comes to windows of trainability, there's broad windows, guys. And what I like, we're showing the Balyer's LTAD right now. Go to Lloyd and Oliver's physical, what is it, YDP, PYD, PYD, that's on the next slide. Youth, yeah, YPD, there we go. Theirs is more logical because you'll notice, well, and I'm assuming we're gonna get to it a little bit, they don't just put these blocks. Okay, this is where you get strong. This is where you can get fast. That's just such BS. The strength window is long. I've trained kids for long periods of times, and some of them gain a little bit of strength and some have gained a ton of strength. It varies a lot. Now, I've trained kids who've gone through puberty and you think they're in their strength window. Oh my God. It's like it's taken a year for them to put 10 pounds on the bar sometimes, right? So there's a lot of variability there, but the windows of trainability are huge. Strength is for life. Power can be for life. And sorry, guys, people in research, people who are in this profession look at the research being done and say it's a joke. These guys don't know what they're talking about. And I've heard that conversation so many times from so many coaches in weightlifting and powerlifting. The researchers have no clue what kids are able to do. So I'm hoping that maybe some of this will be enough to stimulate discussion to make people realize there are other ways to go. Anyway, that's my yelling. Bring it on. What do you got?
Okie let me
If you want to hear me.
cue this up.
Yes. Rafi wants to talk. Let's hear from Rafi.
Go for it.
Well, first, maybe we should get together, Trevor, and
Ooh,
have
that'd be fun.
more detailed conversation. I agree with many things you said.
Can we lift?
And generally speaking, I've been saying for, I don't know, for 30 years or more, 40 years maybe, that a big problem with science, that many scientists know a lot about a very narrow part of the picture, and they think that they can generalize it and give advice to coaches without taking into account all kinds of other considerations. And that's why many coaches are very suspicious of scientists. And I think the connection between science and sport is losing because of that. But saying that there are things that I think are pretty well known. And I'll give you one example with well, maybe more than one, but let's start with biopsies. Biopsies started mainly in Scandinavia years ago, where still today, I think, there are very little ethical obstacles to testing, to doing biopsies in general, and even in children. There was a lot of enthusiasm about muscle biopsies because people thought, well, if I only knew the muscle composition, then I would know immediately whether he's going to be an excellent marathoner or sprinter, middle distance runner, or whatever. That's only very little part of the game. I'll give you an example. In 1976, there was a runner by the name of Don Cardone. He won 4th place in the Olympic marathon. His muscle composition was 50% type 1 and 50% type 2, which was unheard of for marathon runners that usually are in the 70s, 80s, and sometimes more than that, type 1 motor units. And so if you did that and you just looked at that, you'd never predict him getting not to 4th place, just getting to international level marathoning. So this is an example of the limitation. So obviously there are things to be learned when you do biopsies, but I think there's a little too much expectations from that. I don't want to go too deep in that, but this is things we can go more deeply into. Like, as you know, we study a lot children and adults with all kinds of things that involve strength, whether it's we're testing the EMG threshold, or we test explosive strength, or peak rate of torque development, and so forth. We could see, for example, that young gymnasts have the explosiveness of adults, of untrained men, but they didn't have the same strength relative to muscle cross-sectional area or body weight, or whatever you want to normalize it for. So there are differences, but when we have to realize that when we try to develop children, is not to make them kid champions. We want to prepare them, select them and prepare them for being adult successful athletes. So whether or not they hypertrophy to the same extent as adults is not really that important. The important is that you find the children improve their strength very similarly to adult, percentage-wise. So if you continue training, they'll improve. So they improve apparently more by changing or improving muscle coordination, maybe less co-activation and all kinds of other things, and possibly maybe even percentage of muscle activation, which is definitely, almost definitely, we are studying this too, is lower in children. Another point is that in children, you have a very wide range of abilities. There's high variability. Actually, in children, there's higher variability typically than you find in adults. So for example, if you measure strength, and there are people, some scientists that I work with, that say, okay, you measure MVC, you measure 3 times, and then you take the average. We don't take the average, we take the highest, because if you took the average and the children's variability is higher than that of adults, it will bias the results downwards. So we don't do that. And sometimes you find out you have to do more than 3 times to get the actual max. But there's no question that the max is low. But still, when you think about what is your purpose in athlete development, first is to discover the talents. This is often difficult because you might have a talented kid, but you don't know where to send him. You have something you think is a good swimmer, but you don't have a swimming team around, or you have a good runner, but there's no athletic team around. And even now, I'm involved in cycling. There are youth cyclists, but they hardly have any races. And I'm not talking about the COVID period. I'm talking about that. So sometimes they're talking about, the development or the systematic development of the young athlete falls flat because there are no infrastructure around it for doing that. So, and the last thing, well, there are many things I can talk, and then I said, that's why I said I'd like maybe to get together sometimes. The other thing is about talent. Talent, there's not one talent. Some of the talent you see a 9 or 10-year-old kid, and he's head and shoulders above the rest of his peers, and you say, well, he's huge talent, but maybe he's an early developer. And so that's the classical thing of the ugly duckling. Well, maybe some other kids will be better in 3 or 4 years. You don't know. So just the fact that he's talented at 9 doesn't mean he'll be talented at 20 or 29. So, and also some people improve fast okay, but they don't have a very high ceiling, okay? So you can improve fast, and maybe you hit your head against the ceiling, and some other people go more slowly and eventually hit a higher ceiling. So talent is a complicated thing. And again, if you think about the long-term athletic development, you'd like to get the kids that eventually will be doing well as adults, and it's not always as simple to just look for the present apparent talent. Okay, I'll stop here, but if anybody else wants to talk about it, I'd be happy to comment again if there's, again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
First, any comments on the talent ID portion, or also talent transfer, from Dale potentially? I know this is something we talked about a lot in athletics, and it was kind of my opinion, probably our opinions, that a lot of the better athletes for some other sports in Canada are in track and field getting fourth at nationals, or vice versa. So maybe a comment from the talent perspective, Dale, and then I got a few more questions to move this back into a more holistic view of LTAD.
Yeah, I mean, specifically, like, I'd love to get Ian's comments on this too, because he's seen far more years of track and field than either of us combined. But there certainly was the embarrassment of riches that we had within track and field of athletes, where if they were transferred into different sports, I'm sure that they could have had great success in that. And I mean, the whole training grounds was trying to achieve some of that. The problem is that it just ended up being an avenue to support the sports that had already identified individuals that they were already funding, which we can go down a rabbit hole of that of itself. But in something that is like a really fundamentally physiologically based sport like track and field, we still didn't see the talent ID pathway, the pathway that AC had created, where you work with all your way up. So you go to world class, to top 8, to medal performance, podium performance, and essentially how you transition in a linear fashion through that. And if you can't continue to proceed vertically through that pathway, you're essentially just kicked out of the pathway. And the number of athletes we've seen that are removed from that pathway because they have one good year, and 2-3 years later they come back and they're back on the scene. I mean, the amount of times in track and field that I saw that we proved ourselves every single day that we have no idea what we're talking about when it comes to that talent pathway, that we hang our hats on and we dictate our funding based off of literally people getting money and people staying in sport based on this linear trajectory. And that's where this whole LTAD really starts scaring me, just to loop it around a little bit, is when sports start using the intention that was originally created by the researchers or the people who created the model, and it has unintended consequences that actually goes in direct conflict with what the whole intention of the model was. So we actually end up removing people from the system and removing opportunity based on a model that was intended to expand opportunity. And that's really what I saw frequently in track and field. And there's a number of factors to it. And it's not the organization's fault at all. We can talk about this in a number of different sports, but that's something that routinely in the 4 or 5 years I was there, I saw over and over again. We'd cut off someone's funding because they had one bad year, and then they disappeared for 2-3 years, and then they were back in, and they were great 3-4 years from then. I don't understand how we can talk about a model that fails our athletes that poorly and say that it's meant to produce high performance athletes and long-term athletes. It just doesn't, I don't understand how that works.
Yeah, it's certainly not exact. A couple things. First, a call to action, because there's something I think really cool that's been brought up here, the gap of applied research, essentially. The gap between practice and research, especially in Canada. If you look at what strength and conditioning coaches, sports scientists are doing in other countries, a lot of it is more in with the groups that they're actually working with on an ongoing basis. Whereas here, researchers have to deal with the challenge of recruiting participants, and a lot of the participants end up being a population that none of us would be interested in studying anyway. So the call to action is this: research is not that difficult to do. It just depends on how you define that. So for those of us out there working with groups that are taking data, find somewhere to put it. It's really easy to put an abstract in for the Spin Summit, for instance. It's really easy to do up a paper and submit it to the Canadian Strength and Conditioning Association. It will be reviewed, but it's not a rigorous scientific publication where you're going to get shot down. But maybe we need to start somewhere, because we like to criticize what the researchers are doing, but it's difficult, right? Like, you know, I could say, well, I want to know what happens with my 14-year-old divers with respect to vertical jump performance. And the researcher's like, great, get me 20 14-year-old divers and I'll research them. And you're like, well, I can't do that because I'm busy training. Awesome, right? So no one's doing anything. So that's the call to action. Like, let's publish some imperfect research and maybe bridge the gap from our side, from the practice side, into those people that can do these things in a little bit more controlled manner. So that's that. Let's tie this back in potentially for those of you working down through the developmental levels. What are some examples of ways that you have graded your service delivery or graded your coaching from pre-adolescence, adolescence, into young adults and senior teams, provincial or national teams, kind of congruent with the LTAD, or areas where you think that it could be improved upon and some criticisms that you have of it? I know a lot of the discussion as of now has been talking about strength qualities, muscle hypertrophy, etc. How about tying in some of those things? Are there ages that you're trying to tie in those windows of trainability with respect to coordination, development of stretch shortening cycle, or any of that? I know there are a lot of people on here that are kind of working with PSOs or NSOs or groups that really range in age, 15 to 20 years plus. So I guess put simply, how would your service delivery be different if you're going to go and work with U14 Ontario basketball versus you're tasked with going and working a camp for the senior national team for basketball? Are you going to do individual assessments for everybody? Are you going to assume that you need to do more on the physical literacy side for the younger age group or the older age group, vice versa? No idea whatsoever. You don't care.
Jordan, I'll hop in there. Like, I would just say I've been surprised by so many kids at different ages that I wouldn't have a prescription going in anything other than measure, then detect, and then correct. It's that simple. So same as I do with the adults. I would just know that they would hopefully have some of the basics already. That's it.
Yeah, the differences with the youth, the younger, like the 10 to 12-year-old group, is just patience. That's all. That's the difference. And then controlling crowd management. But the overall approach of physical literacy goes at any level. When I was in the States, they had, at the one institute I was at, they had a beginner, intermediate, and advanced, basically, programming that you signed your kids up. The beginners were the 10 to 12 or 13-year-old. Intermediate was 13 to 15, and advanced were 16 and up. And I actually put an end to that, because there's a whole bunch of kids in the beginner level that were ready to go into the advanced level. And there's a whole bunch of kids in the intermediate level that should not have been there. And they were just dragging behind everybody else. We went to a competency-based model of training, where people had to test up and test out to move up the chain, whether they were prepubescent, pubescent, peak height velocity, didn't matter. It was all about movement literacy and their ability to tolerate load and move fast.
Does anybody else, before I knew what LTAD was, actually, I kind of stumbled across something like this due to incompetence. And I developed a competency-based model when I was working at the junior high and high school level. And it's something that I would still do, just better or less bad and more informed. But does anybody else have an example of a competency-based model that they've used to progress through stages of development, whether they're the LTAD stages or not, and things that they were looking for, and can guide us from a kind of on the ground practice, in practice version of how to make sure that we're checking those boxes as far as foundational aspects and prerequisites before we get to that kind of peak development.
I think I can speak in here if you guys want. For me, I mean, long-term athlete development, my first exposure to it was with Dr. Steve Norris, who was starting to speak of it as far as the long-term athlete development of our athletes across the country. And then hearing presentations by Bailly and Colin Higgs, and just looking at the forefathers of the LTAD model, the main primary focus of it, it was really for physical literacy and making sure our kids were more robust. A lot of one-dimensional training was the biggest concern with a lot of our athletes coming up, and 12 months a year of hockey doesn't really build an athlete, it builds a hockey player. So just trying to build athletes who choose hockey later on was really like early requirements of development versus late stage development was really the primary focus of the LTAD. So looking at the documents by Lloyd and Oliver, and looking at the documents put together in the early years by Higgs and Bailly and the group, what it brought attention to me was looking at physical literacy in kids, primarily, never mind the strength windows, and I think Trev did a great job of deciphering a lot of those myths. I think the biggest pieces for me is, I really take a real good look at athleticism with kids, and our kids well-rounded. I mean, majority of Olympians, I think we would all agree on, that we've worked with at the highest levels, come with a laundry list of sports they played growing up, for the most part, unless they were early specializers. But, for me, it's making sure that these kids come up and are well-rounded moving forward. So, a program that we started at Brock University, I don't know if you guys can allow me to share, if anyone can enable sharing. I'll just show you guys.
And Steve, of course we want to hear from you, man.
Nope, still not enabled. One sec.
Steve, while we're waiting for this, you might know, like, why, and maybe keep it somewhat limited so that we don't kill this whole thing. Like, why do the windows of trainability exist in the model? Yep. Because, like, Bailly made that shit up.
No, you know what? It's interesting. I talked to Brent McFarlane, Andrew Yap, and they all had their 5 S's of training. And I think you were trying to come up with a fancy acronym that provided, windows of trainability and bring light to them. But by no means, I think, did they mean to ignore power, change of direction, hypertrophy, as Trevor just pulled up. I think that's what I like about the Lloyd and Oliver document, is that they include those aspects within it. And I think it is a more robust model. But I do think we can all agree there is a peak height velocity that occurs within a young adult. One thing that I've seen is if a female athlete is training through those formative, like, peak height velocity years and the onset of menarche and the onset of peak weight velocity post, they're much better relative strength to their body weight than those who don't. Like, we've seen numerous teams. We train a ton of youth teams at Brock, and it's interesting to see the youth female teams who start on with us later at the age of 13, 14, can't do a push-up, can't do a chin-up, have very poor body control and deceleration and acceleration, versus the kids who train with us through 11, 12, 13, and they breeze through what is normally a difficult stage for a female, and why so many females drop out is because their body changes at such a young age, 10 to 12 years of age, and they have a difficult time with it. So I think a lot of it was that. They wanted a fancy acronym with, the 5 S's. If you look at early speed literature and change of direction, like Brent McFarlane's book on SAC conditioning, if you guys haven't read that one, that's a gem. But he was my wife's track coach coming up. But both he and Yap really published documents on the 5 S's, the 7 S's. And I think that's where the 5 S's come from. So hopefully that answers it. For us at Brock, what we wanted to do was, we noticed a lot of kids were really being painted into 12 months a year of hockey. So we developed a program called Play, physical literacy for active youth. And what that does is we pair it up with youth hockey programs that bring in their kids once or twice a week, and they're being put through a variety of steps of programming in order to develop athletes in a more well-rounded way. So, the one thing that, give me one sec to pull up another doc. with play is we started to look at all the fundamental movement skills. So looking at gymnastics, looking at SAQ phases, so all the different variations of gymnastics and what they were. If you guys don't, I mean, I've been involved in Gymnastics Canada for years, but with my daughter now being a highly competitive provincial gymnast, like Trev hit the nail on the head. You don't know what your kids are capable of until you put them in scenarios where they're being tested and pushed. And I mean, I'll bring up one scenario where watching my daughter do on a deep high jump mat, a rear foot elevated with a teammate holding her foot for 30 seconds, you know, an explosive single leg jump with her back foot being held and doing that for 30-second reps for 5-6 sets. I mean, we don't push our kids nearly enough, and I would agree with it. You know, there's a fine line in gymnastics, but to watch her do like a straddle and then single arm pull-ups with just her arms up, or not single arm, but arm rows all the way up to like rope climbs up to the ceiling and back down for 4 or 5 sets, you know, shows you that, you know, being afraid to push these kids is not what we should be doing. We should be testing their boundaries through exercise and then providing stimulus as they're ready, as Trev mentioned. So, you know, but for us, it's just looking at these skills. A lot of kids lack these rolling and wheeling skills that I think are so important in an athlete as far as just falling in control, and then using like a variety of pieces, but then getting into the SAQ pieces of just speed and agility. And then there's object control and manipulation, change of direction skills, plyos. I mean, we just tried to make, you know, sit down and really look through what were the skills that kids were missing as far as catching skills, dodging skills, hand striking skills. You know, like this is Taylor Thiessen, myself, Dave, Vicky, all sitting down and really, Stacey Woods was a big part of this as well, putting together these kinds of documents. So hopefully this kind of brings light as to what we're doing, but it essentially allows us to put together a curriculum where the kids come in and we're actually developing physical literacy rather than worrying about, you know, when their peak height velocity is. It's more, are they physically literate, and are they, you know, decent athletes at the end of the day? Are they not afraid to bridge into other sports by the time they get into their, you know, if their careers are over, what else can they do? I mean, you think of the best athletes you work with, they all can, I don't know, Tessa Bonham sticks out to me, who's now with TSN, but when we would run warm-up games of, soccer versus ultimate frisbee, she would crush anybody at any of them because she was just the best athlete. She had the best skills. So just, you know, those are my thoughts on it. I mean, you're trying to build an athlete. Lifting and strength and power are important. I'm just looking at also the fundamental skills in their formative years as youth. And being a dad, I look at that even more with my kids. But I mean, it's interesting. My daughter does 16 hours a week of gymnastics. She does 20 on her own of just messing around on a bar and a beam in the basement. So, I mean, it's unstructured play to me that's even more important than structured guidance sometimes.
Thanks for that, Steve. I really like one of the examples you brought up, Steve, and I think that this is where it all gets jacked up in Canada and North America, is the development of general physical preparation in most other countries actually includes strength development. And yeah, it's body weight. Like it might be whatever, body weight squats, lunges, pistol squats, step up, rope climbs, push-ups, all that kind of stuff. In Canada, in North America, we have this like infatuation with this separation of sports skill and tactics and actual physical development. God forbid in phys ed class when kids are younger, or in sport practices, that you actually include something that is progressively appropriate to develop strength as well as coordination, speed, agility, quickness, all these different types of things. But it seems to be the one that we love to just leave out because it's only, and I say only kind of in jest, it's only a foundational capability. It's something that we need as a prerequisite to be good at our sports rather than actually demonstrating within the sport. And I feel like if that was actually present more often, we'd never even be having these. But anyone else have examples of how they've varied their implementation of a developmental model across different age groups within the same sport or different sports, or anything else for that matter?
Rafi, I think you're muted. I think Rafi's trying to speak. I think he's muted.
What? Sorry?
You're
We can hear you now.
open now if you want to speak.
You don't hear me?
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Listen, while we are studying children versus adults and so forth, and there is no doubt the difference in strength, in speed, in rate of thought development, and various other things. One of the questions I'm asking myself all the time, does it mean that we have to train them differently or not? So just by the fact that they are different doesn't necessarily mean that they should have a different training regimen. I don't have, a finalized opinion about this. This is something I'd like to find out eventually, but the point is just the fact we don't have to refute the differences. We might still have to use the same training practices. Eventually, we might find out how you should modify them, but definitely it seems like, those weightlifters that you showed before, maybe it is by training that they got to be able to recruit more of the motor units and coordinate the muscles better and everything. But it doesn't mean that children in general have the same basic abilities and adults. And the variability that we mentioned before means that some of the kids are better than many adults. So you can have a kid that does better than most adults. And it doesn't mean that the phenomenon that we're talking about, like having less muscle activation or less relative strength, that is true for the population, is necessarily true for him or for her. So we remember that when we talk about athletes, we talk about, if we talk about performance athletes that we want to be eventually successful on the world scene, we are talking about the less than 1% of 1% of the population. So to be successful there, you better have a talent that most other people don't have, right? So you might be an outlier in the distribution of abilities, and the overlap between children and adults is quite significant. It's like the same thing as you say, men are stronger than women, but the overlap between men and women is huge. They are different at the edges, but most of them, there's a 90% overlap or something like that, okay? So we have to keep in mind this, and again, the differences don't necessarily mean that we have to use different training techniques.
Just a shout out real quick on men versus women. They did a great 2 or 3 presentations at UBC Performance yesterday, if any of you guys had a chance to check it out. But really good presentations. One in particular by Amanda Jones, one of my former students, did a great presentation on the difference between training males and females and how it's not that different, but still different. So it was really well done if you can get a chance to check it out. Good
comment. I'm going to add something here now, Jordan, if I can.
Yes, man.
Just because, it relates to Rafi's discussion about variation and variability and athlete potential. It's it took me 30 years, but I've come to a conclusion that there is some kind of genetic environmental plateau that exists for males and females when it comes to strength and power potential. It's quite fascinating. In men, I call it the 210 kilo total syndrome. In women, it's about 130 kilo total syndrome. What that means is that if you deal with a new athlete that's coming in and training in Olympic weightlifting, which is your quintessential power output, strength output sport, they will plateau. 80%, 85% of the athletes you work with will plateau at a 90 kilo snatch and 120 kilo clean and jerk. For males, for females, it'll be about a 55 kilo snatch, maybe 60, and an 80 kilo clean and jerk. 85% of the people that you deal with that are new lifters in the first 2 years will hit that plateau. And I've seen this happen dozens of times. And you ask anybody who's somewhat competitive weightlifter, been doing it for a while, caught the bug, been into it, who started late. And you look at them and say, so how's it going? They're probably doing about 90 and 120 kilo clean and jerk. It's crazy. And it's really hard, and it takes years to break that. And a lot of them get hurt on the way. My experience working with kids is they don't get that. They blast right through that. It's like that plateau doesn't exist. And so and we've already discussed this, right? The key is with these kids is to develop those movement skills, those patterns so early, then go through puberty and obviously load through puberty, let what androgens can help them. And then you don't see those plateaus. They just keep moving. It's not perfectly linear, but they just keep going by it. It's less of a barrier. Whereas, when I worked with the Canadian wrestling team, it was the same kind of thing. You kept hitting these power plateaus that is really hard to get past. So I think one of the focus points of this youth development is to be able to get them year-round, long-term, in the weight room setting, learning how to move, and then moving under load, and then moving fast under load, so that when they get to that 16, 17, that play to win, whatever you want to call it, they can actually blast through that and keep progressing. Or perhaps they're already at the level that they need to be at. Like once you're squatting 450 and cleaning 300 kilos, are you okay on the basketball team? I think you'll be all right, right? So. Anybody else seen that plateau? Darren, Grant?
If we talked about that a time before, or I think I heard Darren jumping in there, but how much do we think of that as just environment, right? Like just environment and expectations.
I don't think it's just environment. I think you can bring a stronger person in the room, and a lot of people will get stronger behind them for sure. You're only as strong as the strongest person you're around. But no, it is a 20 to 25-year-old plateau that is a son of a gun to break through. And even if they have good technique and they're doing everything right, it just takes forever for them to break through. And a lot of them get hurt on the way. It's, you go to any weightlifting meet other than provincials, and you're going to see a whole host of that, whether it's the 60 kilo or the 108 kilo lifter, you're seeing that 90, 120. It's really fascinating. Darren.
Well, maybe this is what distinguishes between the men and the boys, I mean, so to speak. I mean, if you are talented, maybe you can go beyond that. And if you're not, you're stuck around that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that is exactly, if you can capture those people. But I think you can also create artificial talent by training people early enough. You can take a mediocre athlete and make them really good by letting their body physically get through that earlier instead of reading that plateau, so that they can get to those higher numbers, right?
So Trev, what you're saying is we have to adopt the Chinese model and take kids out of school at age 8 and get them moving.
Chinese model, we can discuss that. Love to discuss it. You want to talk about early specialization. We rip on specialization all the time, but I think the Chinese model is volume model, and that's what works, whether specialization or not. And I just don't think we have the volume of athletes training in the right ways early enough to really develop our talent pool. That's the bottom line. You go to the US and how it was in Texas, the volume of athletes at that higher level is infinite compared to here in the entire Wellington County where my kid goes to school. There's maybe 4 athletes that stand out that would be able to compete in the US Texas system. And that's because of that development of athletes from an earlier age to do the right things. Although US doesn't always do the right things, mind you.
So what's with Ophia? What's the deal? What's the stopgap? Steve, you seem to know a lot about that.
Yeah, they bring me in to chat at the Physical Literacy Summit each year, and I think the biggest barrier is just the policies and mitigation, risk mitigation is put in place over top of these physical education teachers, where they're really trying, like, kids aren't allowed to invert, they're not allowed to like locomote backwards in case of fusion injuries. It's just and the teachers are beyond fed up with it. It's just, this is what's being told to them top down by administrators who are trying to reduce risk rather than enhance freedom to move, I guess, is basically how I'd put it. So physical literacy is being altered because of administration, not for a lack of want by the physical education teachers. It's more the governing bodies that are hurting us.
So is it an evidence-based model where they need to be provided specific evidence to be able to show that it's beneficial or not as dangerous, or what's that limiting factor?
No, I think they're bringing in like speakers like Colin Higgs who are discussing why it's required. They're bringing in Dean Creelers, who's working with Cirque du Soleil and also produces research out of Manitoba, University of Manitoba. I think you're having like, and he's showing like the volume and the like. His last presentation by Dean was on the development of the femur in a gymnast versus a non-gymnast. Looking from a superior view at the of the body or the neck of the femur, and just the differences in just what loading does and why it's required, and everyone's on the same page. It's just right now it's a governing body that needs to relinquish a bit of their bit of the stronghold on the limitations being placed on what's being taught.
It's also budgetary. Only having one teacher in at one time with as many kids as are in there, it's not really tenable for supervision. Where with the private school where I work, we do fitness classes that are in a gym, loading and everything else, and any days that I'm missing, our injury rate goes way up just because they don't have two sets of eyes.
Yeah, I don't know what the easy answer is there. I've worked with Ophia as well. I've done presentations at their yearly event. I think I've mentioned on this group before that in the human performance training certificate that we had, we didn't have a single physical educator complete that, which was really sad. I've had very few physical educators take any of our strength conditioning workshops that we've had, and very few that have shown up to any of our seminars. There seems a bit of apathy there, but I think that apathy is largely the part of the administrative hurdles that they have to follow and jump just to achieve anything that they do. It's so easy for administrators to say no. It's so easy for administrators to run away due to liability, and there is just not a mass push towards performance education, whether it's academically or physically. You see the same thing when it comes to book smarts. They're really cut corners and do the minimal, and you're seeing that right now with the COVID situation. It's really limited compared to other organizations across the world.
I would also add too, there's an appetite from, like, when I go and present at these conferences, the teachers are all very interested and intrigued, at least the ones that attend your seminar, that they want to learn about physical literacy and locomotion and speed and change of direction. It's just not something that they're taught on. They're not taught the principles and the progressions of how to progress and regress these skills for kids or even human beings, for that fact, throughout their entire education, the formalized education. It's more something you have to learn outside of that formalized undergrad. And that's probably a big piece that they've all voiced, is they want to learn more about these things post-grad.
Yeah, I went through that, as a decent amount of people here know anyways. Like, I'm classically trained as a teacher, whatever that means. I did a phys ed undergrad, which I was fortunate to do, that still had a practical component. But a lot of people that arrive at being a physical education teacher might not have even done a phys ed undergrad. If they did, it might have actually been human kinetics without much of a practical component. There's a small practical component that you do need to do a specialty during your B.Ed as a physical education teacher. But if you do it as a additional basic qualification, it's called, down the road, you don't need that, and you can become qualified. And then the amount that I was taught during my Bachelor of Education, and I had one instructor that was unbelievable and one that wasn't. But I had two full classes, like year-long classes. And if that's what I knew, I wouldn't know much. Let's put it that way. As far as progression, regression, how to deal with groups, there was nothing about developmental, this, that, or the other thing. It was more so about classroom management, and that was about it. So that's kind of what we end up with sometimes. And another one that I think is a way that we can actually affect this, because the political side is slow, and most of us don't have the time or patience to put into that, right? Like, we're not lobbyists, is to inform the people that we work with. And the great change in schools, it's all about the parents. Like, the more parents that you work with, if you're working with youth athletes and you educate them, or the groups that you get in front of along the way, because if you get the more people you get asking about that are pissed off about what their kids aren't getting in school, that's what drives the administration, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Like I said before, it was in the chat. My dad's a retired principal, and initially when I was getting into teaching, what I had said to him is I want to work my way up over time to get to the position where we can actually hold people accountable for results in physical education, as opposed to just, well, is everyone there? Do they have their gym clothes? Yeah, you're doing a great job. If you get kids to grade 9 and they can't read, like, you have questions to answer via the provincial testing, national testing, those types of things. But in physical education, Trev said how no one's focused on performance. No one's actually held accountable for results in any area. Enjoyment, fun, physical literacy, fitness, health, performance, sports skill, nothing. There's no links to any of that as far as accountability goes. So I think a call to action as a strength and conditioning coach and people that are experts in this area are the more information that we can give the public and parents so that they can keep asking these questions, maybe over time it gets affected a little bit. As we're coming up on 90 minutes, did anybody have any other comments or questions about things that we've chatted about here today? And then at the end, we'll leave it up to Trev to introduce next week's topic. Okay, if not, thanks for everybody, especially we got some new faces on here, really great, and some potential new interactions and collaborations that we can probably get on. And remember a couple of those things that I talked about, like I do feel really strongly about imperfect research. There's probably a better term for that someone smarter than me can come up with, but we don't have enough of it. If you think about a lot of the things that we base our practice on from way back in the day, or any of this stuff that grandly falls under the general term of Russian journals, that's all it was. It was coaches that kept notes. It was coaches that kept results, and they got published, because back then it was, if you print it in a book, it was published. And we can still do that now. It's easy to put it out. So, a little bit of a call to action for all of us, especially, people. I know people on here that have like wicked databases back years and years and years, and it's better than anything that's out there in a journal. Like some of the Doc's not on here anymore, and some of the stuff that Dave might have. So let's try to find a way to get that stuff out there, and then hopefully we can bridge the gap from the applied side into the research. Trev, you're up for next week.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I thought it was a fun topic today. Time flew for me, so that's a good thing. And thanks, Rafi, for joining in. You're not a regular here, but I hope to see more of you in these kinds of forum where we can call on your research expertise and then maybe set up some applied learning and applied research opportunities down in Brock, because we always have a great relationship with those folks from Brock. Go Badgers. Anyway, I just want to hype next week. Next week, you've probably heard about using force plates for predicting and talent identification, predicting performance, predicting risk, predicting return to play. So we're going to open it up next week and talk about these force plates a bit. And we're inviting a company named Sparta. So there's a fellow named Eric Cluft, who I worked with in Texas, who's now one of the main guys at Sparta. And Sparta sells a force plate system that tries to super simplify the process of assessing what level of trainability your athlete's at, level of risk, whether or not they're return to play, et cetera, using these force plate systems. Now they sell them for profit, yes, and they're going to try and convince you to buy their product. But what's interesting next week is we have a couple hardcore researchers like our good friend Devin Frayne, and sounds like Steve Hirsch might be in on it as well from U of T. And so we're going to have a little throwdown talking about force plates and whether or not they're useful for predicting performance, and whether or not this Sparta system is something that's maybe got some potential. When I first saw it, I thought it was complete hoke, but I've seen it grow over the last 5 years. And you know what? I think they may be onto something. I'm just not good enough or smart enough to know if it's really on the right track. So hopefully next week we'll figure all that out. Oh, Darren, you threw something in there? All right, just a comment. All right, good. All right, so that's it for me, Jordan.
Okay, that wraps it up for this week. We're actually done on time. So thanks for everybody that new and old or new and previous for joining us and listening to a presentation from Trev, and then spinning it back around into some of our own experiences. So we'll see you next week. If you want to be added and you aren't getting the emails with the invites, just let one of us know, myself, Trev, Sam, or anybody else on here. Have a good weekend.
All right, guys, take care. If you want to get on my mailing list, drop me a line.
Thanks, guys. Have a good weekend.